The hospital lobby was full of noise that morning. Nurses hurried in their crisp uniforms, the wheels of stretchers rolled across the polished floor, and worried relatives sat with anxious eyes waiting for news. Among this rush of people, one man stood out without even trying. Alexander Grant, the CEO of one of the largest companies in the city, walked with the quiet authority of someone who never had to explain himself. His dark tailored suit was spotless, his shoes shined as if they had never touched the dust outside, and his expression was firm, almost cold. People often said he carried the weight of his empire on his shoulders, but if anyone dared to ask him, he would deny it. He was a man who lived for control of his company, of his time, and of his emotions. That morning, Alexander had not come to the hospital for personal reasons. It was a quick stop on his way to a meeting with the hospital board about funding a new medical wing. For him, it was another business task, nothing more. He stood near the reception desk, checking his watch, when something unusual broke his focus. A small tug at the edge of his suit sleeve made him glance down. There, standing no higher than his waist, was a little girl. Her hair was tied in uneven braids, the ribbon slightly loose, and her eyes were wide, clear, and filled with innocence. She looked around 6 years old, though her thin frame made her appear even smaller. The girl tilted her head up to him and whispered softly, as if afraid of being overheard, "Sir, are you my new daddy?" The words were so unexpected, so out of place, that Alexander froze. For a moment, he wondered if he had heard her right. He blinked, replaying the whisper in his mind. The girl's voice was fragile, carrying both hope and fear, as though she was half afraid of what his answer might be. Alexander cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he asked, his deep voice surprisingly gentle in that instant. The girl clutched the hem of her little dress nervously. Her eyes, bright and searching, looked straight into his, waiting for a response. Around them, people passed by, but in that moment, the busy lobby faded into silence. It was just the girl and him. He knelt down slowly, surprising himself. He never bent for anyone, not in meetings, not in negotiations, not even in casual conversations. Yet, here he was, lowering himself to a child's height. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice low, cautious. "Lily," she said, her lips curving into a shy smile. "Mommy says Daddy is in heaven. But I asked her, if maybe God would send me a new one. And then I saw you." Her words pierced him more deeply than he cared to admit. He had built walls around himself for years, walls no one had ever dared to climb. But this child, with her soft voice and hopeful eyes, had stepped right through them without even trying. Alexander searched for words, but before he could respond, hurried footsteps approached. "Lily," a woman's voice called out. A young nurse came rushing toward them. She looked barely older than her mid-20s, her hair neatly tied back, her uniform slightly wrinkled from long hours of work. She knelt quickly and pulled the girl into her arms. "I'm so sorry," she said breathlessly, her eyes darting up at Alexander. Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "She shouldn't have bothered you, sir." Alexander straightened, his calm mask slipping back into place. But inside, he felt a strange tug, one he couldn't explain. The nurse looked at her daughter with a gentle firmness. "Lily, what did I tell you about talking to strangers?" "But mommy," Lily whispered, holding tightly onto her mother's arm, "I thought, maybe he's my new daddy." Her words carried across the lobby, making a few people turn their heads in surprise. The nurse's face grew red, and she lowered her gaze, as though wishing the ground would open and swallow her whole. "I'm very sorry," she repeated to Alexander, her voice quiet and tired. Alexander studied her for a moment. Her features were soft, but there was exhaustion in her eyes, the kind that comes from carrying more responsibility than one person should. Her uniform told him she worked long shifts, perhaps without much rest. He glanced at Lily again, noting the frailty in the child's arms and the slight paleness in her cheeks. Normally, Alexander would have brushed the matter aside. He was not a man who entertained strangers, much less emotional entanglements. But this time, he did not walk away. Instead, he asked, "Is she unwell?" The nurse froze, caught off guard by his question. "She's fine," she said quickly, almost defensively. Then she adjusted Lily's hair, avoiding his eyes. "Please, don't worry about us." But Alexander did worry, though he could not explain why. The child's question still echoed in his mind, refusing to leave. "Are you my new daddy?" The innocence of it unsettled him, as if some part of his soul long buried beneath years of ambition had been touched. "Come along, Lily," the nurse whispered, guiding her daughter away. Lily looked back over her shoulder, her little hand waving slightly, her eyes still hopeful. "Goodbye, sir," she said softly. Alexander's chest tightened. He gave a small nod, though his usual stern expression remained. He watched them walk away down the corridor, disappearing into the crowd. When his assistant came to inform him that the hospital board was ready, Alexander found himself distracted, his mind not on business for once. The image of the small girl tugging at his sleeve refused to fade. The sound of her whisper lingered as though etched into his thoughts. For a man who lived in control of everything, this simple, unexpected encounter shook something deep within him. He didn't know it yet, but that one question from a little girl in the hospital lobby had just changed the course of his life forever. The lobby slowly returned to its usual rush after Lily and her mother disappeared down the corridor, but Alexander's thoughts refused to return to order. He carried the weight of meetings and deals every single day, yet the whisper of a little girl had unsettled him in a way that billion-dollar negotiations never could. Later that afternoon, after his meeting with the hospital board, Alexander found himself wandering near the children's ward. He told himself it was coincidence. He told himself he was simply curious about the facility he was planning to fund. But deep down, he knew it wasn't entirely true. Something about that small child with uneven braids and eyes too wise for her age pulled at him. He didn't expect to see them again, but fate had other plans. As he stepped quietly into the hallway, he noticed the same nurse from earlier, Emily. She was adjusting a blanket over a bed in one of the rooms. Beside her sat Lily, her legs swinging gently as she hummed a tune to herself. The sight was ordinary and yet oddly tender. Emily brushed Lily's hair back with a mother's care, whispering something that made the little girl giggle. Alexander lingered by the doorway without entering. Something told him that his presence might be unwelcome. Still, he found himself unable to walk away. He was a man used to being in control, yet at that moment, he was at the mercy of his own curiosity. Emily noticed him then. She stiffened, her hands pausing mid-motion. A flicker of unease crossed her face, quickly replaced by polite professionalism. "Mr. Grant," she said, her voice carefully steady. "Do you need something?" Her tone wasn't disrespectful, but it wasn't warm either. It was the guarded voice of someone who had learned not to expect kindness from strangers. Alexander stepped into the room, his tall frame filling the doorway. "I was only passing by," he said smoothly, though even he wasn't sure if that was the truth. His gaze shifted toward Lily. "How is she?" Emily hesitated before answering. "She's fine. Just a regular checkup today." "Mommy," Lily chimed in suddenly, "he's here again." Her small voice carried genuine delight, as though she had been waiting for him. She looked at Alexander with bright eyes, almost certain of something her mother wasn't. Emily shushed her gently, embarrassed. "Lily, remember what we talked about." "But, Mommy," Lily whispered, leaning close, "maybe God really did send him." Alexander heard every word. Though he was not a man who entertained talk of fate or miracles, her innocence struck him once more. Emily turned to him, her cheeks slightly pink. "I apologize again for what happened earlier," she said firmly. She doesn't understand. Children sometimes say things without thinking." Alexander studied her face carefully. Her voice was strong, but he could see the fatigue in her eyes, the exhaustion of someone carrying too many responsibilities alone. He thought of how different she was from the polished executives and socialites he usually dealt with. There was no pretense here, no mask, only the plain truth of struggle and care. "There's no need to apologize," Alexander said quietly. "She's only a child." Emily nodded once, as though she was determined to end the conversation. She turned back to her daughter, busying herself with Lily's things. But Alexander did not leave. Instead, he stepped closer, his eyes softening just slightly. "Does she live here often?" he asked, careful with his words. Emily's hands froze for a second before continuing. "No," she replied, her tone a little too quick. "Just visits when needed." It wasn't a full answer, and Alexander noticed. He was a man who could read people, who built empires by noticing what others tried to hide. And right now, he saw clearly that Emily was hiding something. Not out of deceit, but out of pride or maybe fear. Lily tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mommy, can he stay for a little while?" Emily's lips parted in surprise, then pressed into a thin line. Lily, Alexander interrupted gently, surprising even himself. "I can stay for a few minutes if it's all right." Emily hesitated, her eyes meeting his. There was suspicion there, and caution, but also the faintest flicker of relief, though she quickly tried to bury it. After a long pause, she nodded once. Alexander took a seat near the corner of the room, his posture composed yet oddly uneasy. He was not used to being in such settings. Boardrooms, grand offices, five-star hotels, those were his worlds. But here, in a modest hospital room with a child humming softly, he felt strangely out of place, almost vulnerable. Lily looked at him with fascination, as though she couldn't quite believe he was real. "Do you like stories?" she asked suddenly. Alexander raised a brow. "Stories?" "Yes," she said eagerly, swinging her legs. "Mommy reads them to me. Sometimes about princesses. Sometimes about animals. Do you like them?" For a moment, Alexander didn't know how to answer. No one had asked him such a simple question in years. His life had been consumed by numbers, contracts, and power. Stories. Those belonged to a childhood he had long forgotten. "I suppose I haven't read one in a long time," he admitted finally. Lily's smile widened. "Then maybe I can tell you one." Emily tried to hush her, but Alexander raised a hand slightly, a faint trace of amusement flickering in his otherwise composed face. "I would like that," he said. And so Lily began to tell him a story half made up, half remembered from something her mother once read. Her small voice carried the room, filling it with a kind of magic that didn't exist in the business world Alexander knew. She spoke of a lonely princess who prayed for someone to keep her safe, and of a brave man who appeared when she least expected. As she spoke, Alexander felt something stir within him. It wasn't just the story. It was the way she looked at him while telling it, as if she believed he could be that brave man. When Lily finally grew tired, leaning against her mother's arm, Emily brushed her hair back gently. She glanced at Alexander again, her expression softer now, though still cautious. "She has a big imagination," Emily murmured. Alexander nodded, his eyes lingering on the child who had fallen half asleep. "Sometimes imagination shows us truths we ignore." Emily blinked at his words, surprised. She hadn't expected depth from a man like him, a man whose name often appeared only in business magazines and financial reports. Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but weighted with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Alexander rose to his feet. "I should go," he said, his voice calm. Emily stood too, as if unsure how to respond. "Thank you, for being kind to her." He inclined his head, the faintest of nods. "Children deserve kindness." And with that, he left the room. But as he walked down the long corridor, Alexander realized something unusual. He felt reluctant to leave. For the first time in years, he had stepped outside the walls of his carefully controlled life. And somewhere deep inside, he knew he would be back. Alexander had returned to his world of meetings, contracts, and endless phone calls, but his thoughts kept slipping back to the hospital. It wasn't like him to be distracted. Normally, once he left a place, it was gone from his mind unless it held business value. But this time was different. For days, he found himself recalling the look in Lily's eyes when she told him her story. Her voice still echoed in his memory, filled with faith and innocence. Even Emily's cautious, almost defensive manner stayed with him. He had seen countless people hide behind masks of confidence and pride, but hers was different. Hers came from survival, not pretense. One evening, as Alexander reviewed documents in his office, a thought struck him. If his company was planning to donate funds to the hospital, he had every reason to check into its records. It was logical. It was business. Or at least, that's what he told himself. The next morning, he requested a quiet update from the hospital's administration about the children's ward. On the list of patients, one name caught his attention: Lily Carter. His chest tightened as he read the brief note beside it: ongoing treatment, condition requires monitoring, high medical costs. He sat back in his chair, the file trembling slightly in his hand. He had seen countless numbers in his life, but these ones weren't just numbers. They belonged to the fragile little girl who had tugged at his sleeve and asked him the question he still couldn't forget. Alexander closed the file slowly. He was not a man who gave in to sentiment. Yet, something in him stirred, urging him to do something, anything for the child. That afternoon, without informing Emily, he quietly instructed his assistant to arrange for Lily's medical expenses to be covered by a private donation. It was anonymous. He didn't want thanks, nor did he want attention. He only wanted the child to have the care she deserved. But secrets rarely stayed hidden for long. A week later, Emily was called into the hospital office, where she was informed that her daughter's treatment costs had been unexpectedly taken care of. She froze, unable to understand. The relief in her heart was immense, but alongside it came suspicion. Who would do such a thing? When she stepped out of the office, she saw Alexander at the far end of the corridor, speaking with a doctor. Their eyes met briefly. And in that moment, something inside her clicked. Later, as she was leaving with Lily, she found Alexander waiting near the entrance. His hands were in his pockets, his tall frame calm as ever. "You," she said quietly, her voice mixed with disbelief and frustration. He didn't answer immediately. His gaze shifted to Lily, who was skipping a few steps ahead, humming to herself. Then he looked back at Emily. "She deserves the best care." Emily's jaw tightened. "And you think money is the answer to everything?" Alexander's expression remained unreadable. "Isn't it, in cases like this?" Her hands curled into fists at her sides. "You don't know what it's like, Mr. Grant. To struggle every single day. To wonder if you'll have enough to give your child what she needs. You can't just walk in with your wealth and fix things as if it gives you the right to step into our lives." For the first time in a long while, Alexander found himself at a loss for words. He had expected gratitude, perhaps even relief. But Emily's words carried the weight of years of hardship, and he realized she wasn't angry because of the money itself. She was angry because she had learned to stand on her own, and his gesture felt like a threat to that fragile independence. "I didn't mean to offend you," he said after a long pause. His voice was low, more human than corporate. Emily's eyes softened for just a moment, but then she shook her head. "Why, then. Why her? Why us? Alexander looked away briefly, as though searching for an answer even he didn't fully understand. Because she asked me a question I can't forget, he admitted finally. Emily blinked, stunned. She looked at me and asked if I was her new father, Alexander continued, his voice steady but faintly pained. And I realized, no one should ever have to ask that. Silence hung between them. Emily's throat tightened, her defenses wavering. She hadn't told anyone about how often Lily asked about her father. It was a wound she carried silently, not wanting to burden her child with the truth. Her father, Emily began, her voice trembling slightly. He left before she was even born. He never wanted to take responsibility. I told myself I could raise her alone, that I didn't need anyone else. But when she looks at other children with their fathers, I see the questions in her eyes. And I can't give her the answers she wants. Alexander listened, his expression unreadable, but inside, her words struck him harder than any business loss ever could. He understood abandonment, though in a different form. His own life had been marked by loneliness despite success, and now he saw that same loneliness reflected in the eyes of a little girl who longed for something she had never known. Emily, he said carefully, almost hesitantly, there's something you should know. She looked at him warily. What is it? Alexander took a breath, as though weighing whether to speak. Your daughter's father, my brother, knew you, didn't he? Emily froze, her eyes widening. The truth she had buried for years surfaced all at once. Her lips parted, but no words came. Finally, after a long, heavy silence, she whispered, yes. He was your brother. Alexander's face darkened. 1,000 memories rushed back, memories of his younger brother, reckless and irresponsible, always chasing freedom and leaving behind chaos. He had tried to protect his brother for years, but nothing had ever changed. And now, standing before Emily, he realized just how deep the consequences of his brother's choices had run. He left you, Alexander said, his voice low, almost bitter. Emily's eyes glistened, though she held herself strong. Yes. He walked away when I needed him most. I never told Lily. I didn't want her to feel abandoned. I just told her her father was in heaven, so she wouldn't carry the pain of the truth. Alexander's fists clenched at his sides. He had spent his life cleaning up after his brother's mistakes, but this was different. This was a child's future, a woman's dignity, a broken story that should never have been written. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Lily, unaware of the heavy conversation, ran back and tugged on her mother's hand, smiling brightly. Mommy, can we go home now? Emily quickly wiped her eyes and smiled at her daughter. Yes, sweetheart. Let's go. Before leaving, she turned to Alexander. Her voice was calm, but her eyes carried a storm of emotions. Please, Mr. Grant. Whatever you feel you owe us, don't. I've learned to stand on my own. And Lily, she doesn't need broken promises. With that, she walked away with her daughter, leaving Alexander standing in the hospital corridor, his heart heavier than ever before. He had entered the hospital weeks ago for business, and now he found himself caught in a story he could not escape. For the first time, the powerful CEO realized that this was not about money, not about charity. It was about responsibility, family, and choices made long ago. And he silently vowed that this time, his brother's mistakes would not define the future. Alexander told himself, time after time, that he needed to step back. It was none of his business. He was not the girl's father, not her guardian, not even a family friend. He was only a man who happened to be in the wrong place at the right time. That was all. And yet, despite every logical argument he repeated to himself, he found his feet turning toward the hospital again and again. At first, he came under the excuse of checking progress on the new medical wing. It was part of his company's donation, after all, and no one questioned why the CEO wanted to look over things personally. But his eyes often drifted toward the children's ward. And no matter how hard he tried to resist, he always ended up walking that way. It was Lily who always spotted him first. No matter how quietly he entered, she seemed to sense his presence. Her little face would brighten, and she would run to him with her arms stretched wide, as if she had been waiting just for him. "You came back," she would say with pure delight, as though he had returned from a long journey just for her. Alexander wasn't used to being welcomed that way. In the world he lived in, people greeted him with respect, sometimes with fear, and often with expectation. But never with simple happiness. Never with the kind of joy that asked for nothing in return. One afternoon, Lily tugged at his sleeve and pulled him toward a corner of the ward where puzzles and toys were kept for the children. "Help me, please," she said eagerly, showing him the pieces of a picture puzzle spread out on the floor. Alexander looked at the puzzle as if it were a contract written in another language. He had negotiated billion-dollar deals, but this simple game of colors and shapes felt like uncharted territory. Still, he knelt beside her, his expensive suit brushing the floor tiles, and began fumbling with the pieces. Lily laughed. "Not like that. You're forcing it. You have to be patient." He glanced at her, a little amused. "Patience has never been my strength." "Then you should practice," she said matter-of-factly, sounding far older than her years. For a moment, Alexander just stared at her. This small girl, with her ribbon slightly untied and her shoes a little worn, spoke to him with the kind of wisdom he rarely heard even in boardrooms. And somehow, her words stayed with him long after she returned to fitting the puzzle. Emily entered a few minutes later. She stopped at the doorway, her eyes widening at the sight of the powerful CEO crouched on the floor, trying to help her daughter build a picture of a smiling cartoon animal. For a moment, she said nothing. Her heart tightened, unsure whether to laugh or to worry. When Alexander finally noticed her, he cleared his throat and straightened slightly, as if embarrassed to be caught. But Lily quickly announced, "Mommy, he's helping me. And he's not bad at it either." Emily forced a small smile, though her heart was restless. She wanted to be grateful, but she also wanted to protect her daughter. She knew how easily Lily could grow attached, and she couldn't risk letting her hope for something that might disappear again. Still, she watched silently as the two of them worked together. And against her will, a small warmth began to spread in her chest. Later that evening, as the sun dipped beyond the hospital windows, Lily grew tired and leaned against her mother's arm. Her eyelids fluttered shut, and within moments, she was asleep. Alexander stood, brushing the dust from his suit, and looked down at the little girl resting peacefully. Something shifted in his expression, something softer than Emily had ever seen before. "You shouldn't let her get too close to me," he said suddenly, his voice low. Emily's head snapped up. "Then why are you here, Mr. Grant?" The question cut sharply through the air. Alexander paused, struggling with the answer. For a man who always had quick, clever responses, silence was unusual. Finally, after a long moment, he admitted quietly, "Because I can't seem to stay away." Emily's breath caught. Her heart wanted to believe him, but her mind reminded her of pain, of broken trust, of nights spent alone with a crying child who never understood why her father wasn't there. "She already lost one man she called Daddy," Emily whispered, stroking Lily's hair. "I won't let her be hurt again. I can't." Alexander's jaw tightened. His eyes darkened, but his voice was steady. "I'm not my brother, Emily." Her head jerked slightly at his words. She searched his face, and for a moment she saw nothing but sincerity. It scared her, because sincerity could break her walls. In the weeks that followed, Alexander became a quiet presence in their lives. He never demanded space, but somehow he was always there. Sometimes he brought small gifts, never extravagant, just thoughtful things Lily loved, like storybooks or drawing crayons. Sometimes he walked them out after long days at the hospital. People noticed. Whispers spread through the hospital corridors. Nurses exchanged glances. Doctors quietly speculated. The icy, untouchable CEO was being seen too often in the children's ward, and always near the same nurse and her daughter. But Alexander didn't care. For once, he wasn't living for the opinions of others. One evening, as they walked out together, Lily held both their hands, her small fingers wrapped tightly around theirs. She swung her arms between them and giggled. "See? Now it's like we're a family." Emily froze. Her heart lurched painfully, but before she could say anything, Alexander spoke first. His voice was quiet, almost tender. "Maybe one day." Emily's head snapped toward him, her eyes wide. "Don't," she whispered fiercely, her voice shaking. "Don't say things like that. Don't give her promises you can't keep." Alexander stopped walking. He looked at her with an intensity that made her chest tighten. "I don't make promises I can't keep," he said firmly. Emily stared at him, speechless. The world around them seemed to blur for a moment, as though time had paused. She wanted to tell him to stop, to walk away, to leave them in peace. But her lips wouldn't form the words. That night, when Lily was asleep, Emily sat by the window of their small apartment. She stared at the stars and replayed the day in her mind. Her daughter's laughter. Alexander's patience with the puzzle. His words that still echoed in her chest. Was it possible that someone could step into their lives and truly stay? Was it safe to even hope? Across the city, Alexander stood in his penthouse, staring at the skyline. The glittering lights below him had always represented power and control. But tonight, they meant nothing. His thoughts were with a little girl who believed in him without hesitation, and with a woman who looked at him with both hope and fear. And deep inside, he knew something had changed forever. No matter how much he tried, he could no longer ignore the bond pulling him closer to them. The bond between Alexander and Lily had grown stronger with each passing week. What started as a curious encounter in a hospital lobby had become something no one could ignore. Lily now looked for him in every corner of the ward, and her eyes would light up the moment she spotted him. Emily tried to keep her guard up, but even she noticed how her daughter's laughter had become brighter, how her days seemed lighter whenever Alexander was near. And though fear still lingered in her heart, she could not deny the truth: he was becoming a part of their lives. But life had a way of testing bonds, and soon the test arrived. One late evening, Emily sat by Lily's hospital bed while the doctor explained that Lily's condition had worsened. Her treatment needed to change. The new procedure was costly and required constant supervision. Emily's heart sank as she listened. She had worked endless hours, sacrificed sleep, and saved every penny, but it would never be enough. When Alexander entered the room and saw the worry on Emily's face, he immediately sensed something was wrong. "What happened?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Emily hesitated, then shook her head. "It's nothing you need to concern yourself with." "Emily," he said, stepping closer, his tone unyielding. "Tell me." Her lips trembled as she finally whispered, "The doctors say her condition is more serious than before. She needs stronger treatment, something I can't afford. But I'll find a way. I always have." Alexander's chest tightened. He looked at Lily, who was sleeping peacefully, unaware of the storm around her. For the first time in years, Alexander felt powerless, not because of money or business, but because a small life hung in the balance, and he couldn't bear to imagine losing her. "Emily," he said quietly but firmly, "let me help." "No," she said instantly, shaking her head. "I told you before." I don't want her growing up thinking everything depends on someone else's wealth. I won't let her hope for something that might vanish again. This isn't about money, Alexander replied, his voice rising just slightly. It's about saving her life. Emily looked at him, torn between pride and fear. And what if one day you decide you've had enough? What if you walk away? I can't let her get attached to someone who might leave. I can't watch her heart break the way mine did. Alexander was silent for a long moment. Then he stepped closer, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity she couldn't ignore. I'm not going anywhere, he said firmly. I'm not my brother. I don't run away from responsibility. And whether you accept it or not, Lily is part of my family now. I won't turn my back on her. Emily's throat tightened, tears pricking her eyes. She wanted to argue, but his words carried a weight she couldn't deny. The next few weeks were difficult. Lily's treatment began, and Alexander was there for every step. He sat beside her bed when she was tired, he told her simple stories when she couldn't sleep, and he brought small surprises to make her smile. The staff watched in quiet amazement as the usually cold CEO transformed into a man full of patience and warmth whenever the little girl was near. Emily watched too. At first, she was cautious, always expecting him to step back. But he never did. He came every day, no matter how busy his schedule was. And slowly, against her will, her heart began to soften. One night, when Lily was finally asleep, Emily stepped out into the quiet hospital garden. She needed air, space to think. Alexander found her there, standing beneath the dim light of a lamp, her face thoughtful. You've changed her world, Emily said softly without looking at him. And mine too. Alexander's expression softened. She's changed mine more than I can explain. Emily turned to face him, her voice trembling. I don't know if I can trust this. I don't know if I can trust you. Then don't trust my words, he said gently. Trust my actions. I'll prove it every day, for as long as it takes. Her eyes searched his face, and for the first time, she didn't see the powerful CEO everyone else feared. She saw a man who cared, a man who was choosing to stay. The final test came weeks later, when Lily had a particularly difficult night. Her small hand clung tightly to Alexander's, her eyes half closed with exhaustion. Don't leave, Daddy, she whispered faintly. Emily froze, her breath catching. The word had slipped from her daughter's lips so naturally, so surely, as if it had always been true. She turned to Alexander, waiting to see how he would respond. Alexander's eyes softened, and he squeezed Lily's hand gently. I'm not leaving, he whispered back. I'll always be here. Tears filled Emily's eyes as she watched. For years, she had carried everything alone, convinced she had no one to lean on. But in that moment, she realized she wasn't alone anymore. When morning came, Lily opened her eyes and smiled weakly. See, Mommy. I told you God would send someone. Emily bent down, kissing her daughter's forehead, then looked at Alexander. For the first time, she didn't see him as a stranger, or as her past's shadow. She saw him as the man who had chosen them, both of them, without hesitation. And in that quiet hospital room, something shifted. The walls Emily had built for years finally began to fall. Weeks later, Lily's health improved under the new treatment. She regained her strength slowly, and her laughter once again filled the hospital corridors. On the day she was finally discharged, Alexander was there, carrying her bag as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Emily walked beside them, her hand brushing against his every now and then. As they stepped into the sunlight outside, Lily held both their hands and whispered happily, "Now I have a family." Alexander and Emily looked at each other. No words were spoken, but both knew the truth: this was no longer chance. This was choice. A choice of the heart. And from that day forward, None of them ever walked alone again.